Today I'm going to speak about a double murder that took place in 1989. Two people were killed involving the cotton industry on Long Island and the Lucchese family. The Kubeckas have a long history in the garbage hauling business, which started with Jerry Kubecka, who named the company after himself. And trouble with the mob for him started long ago. In and around the mid-60s, Jerry began experiencing trouble with mob-controlled companies. He argued against increasing rates and also refused to be part of the union, which caused him many forms of harassment for years. By the late 70s, Jerry became tired and passed the torch over to his son, Robert. Growing up, he witnessed his father deal with the mob's tactics of intimidation, which taught him not to give in to unjust demands. Jerry enjoyed trash hauling, and just like his father, he began to experience the mob's way of doing business. But Jerry refused to give in to their ways. At first, he decided to take matters into his own hands by recording meetings, and he eventually went to the Organized Crime Task Force with his complaints and handed over the taped conversations. In the early 80s, the state began investigating the garbage hauling industry on Long Island. What came to light was that mob-controlled carting companies had an agreement to rig bids on contracts in order to monopolize the industry. And any attempts made by rebel companies not going along with the program will be met by intimidation and threats of violence. The investigation confirmed the infiltration of organized crime into the carting and garbage hauling industry. In July of 1982, Robert Kubecka and his partner and brother-in-law, Donald Barstow, were named in the task force's first wiretap application. Astonishingly, that document was turned over to the very people the task force were investigating. Consequently, the task force would claim that Kubecka and Bostow's names were inadvertently given to defense lawyers, which was pure bullshit. They were so worried about making cases that protecting the identities of witnesses was not a priority. An interesting fact is, supposedly, it was Kubecka who suggested the task force place a bug in Sal Avellino's Jaguar, which is exactly what they did on March 18, 1983, while the car was parked at the Huntington townhouse. That bug produced the famous Jaguar tapes between Avellino, a Lucchese captain, and the Lucchese boss and underboss, Tony Ducks Corallo and Salvatore Santoro. As a result of those recordings, it was the first time that Cosa Nostra members been taped talking about the commission. In September of 1983, Kubecka and Barstow were scheduled to testify before a grand jury, but Kubecka had cold feet and feared that testifying would expose them. In an attempt to manipulate him, he was told that without his testimony, there would be no indictments. And ultimately, he was convinced to reconsider, and both Kubecka and Barstow gave their testimony. By September 1984, 21 people were charged with using coercion and bid rigging in order to dominate the private carting industry on Long Island. By doing so, they inflated consumer costs by $10 million annually. Among the indicted were Tony Ducks, Santoro, and Avellino. Essentially, the indictment charged that the Lucchese family conspired with other companies to control routes and set prices and would intimidate any carters that didn't go along with their plan. Basically, what Kubecka and Barstow testified to at the grand jury was that the mob controlled the collection territories in Nassau and Suffolk counties by using threats, harassment, and strong-arm tactics. It was estimated that Long Island businessmen paid 50% more and residents 15% more for trash collections. Ronald Goldstock, the director of the New York State Organized Crime Task Force, made reference to Kubecka and Barstow's testimony. The carting industry has been controlled for such a long time that it's very unusual for individuals to speak out against those who are doing the controlling. 9 carters would plead guilty to coercion charges, including Avellino. Consequently, they would all receive community service. Avellino owned Salem Sanitary Carting and was allowed to delegate a worker to do the community service for him. Tony Ducks, on the other hand, had bigger problems than garbage. Both Santoro and he were indicted in February 1985 for the commission case and would ultimately receive a 100-year sentence. In December 1988, the FBI began investigating the carting industry and approached Kubecka and Barstow to cooperate in that investigation. Both men were willing to assist with the stipulation that their identities be kept confidential, and they were assured that this would be the case. The FBI encouraged them to expand their routes, knowing this would further provoke the mob-controlled companies. Naturally, by bidding routes at their lower cost, customers would give them the contract and more trouble would come their way. Some customers were threatened that if they changed companies, they would get bricks through their windows. Kubecka started noticing that he was being followed to work and when he went home at the end of the day. The wives of both men received threats, and people were following their children home from school as well. Both families were feeling terrorized. According to Kubecka's sister, who happened to be married to Barstow, one day someone came to the office and slapped her brother's glasses off his face. On another occasion, after Kubecka exited a truck, someone threw a Molotov cocktail into the cab, setting it on fire. There was incidents where sugar was poured into the gas tanks of theirs and the workers' cars. Their customers were threatened with trouble if they continued doing business with them. Those that ignored the threats had their containers set on fire. Despite all the harassment, the partners continued to conduct business. Realizing their intimidation was not having the effect that they hoped for, in a last-ditch effort, the mob approached Kubecka and gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. They wanted to buy him out. Avellino even attempted to make a commission off of the deal, but Kubecka refused. As a result, a meeting was held in Howard Beach at the Surfside Motel, which belonged to Vicamuso. Also in attendance was Gaspipe Casso and Sal Avellino. The Lucchese family had information, possibly from Gaspipe's crooked cops, Eppolito and Caracappa, that Robert Kubecka was cooperating in an FBI investigation. Avellino asked permission to kill Kubecka and was given a nod. By June of 1989, federal prosecutors were finalizing a racketeering indictment against Carters from Long Island with the help of information provided by Kubecka and Barstow. Gaspipe appointed a Lucchese captain from the Bronx, Anthony Boat Barada, to oversee the hit. Boat organized the hit team, which included himself, Sal Avellino's brother Carmine, Frankie Pearl Federici, and Rocco Vitulli. At the time, Federici and Vitulli were associates. In August 1989, Avellino met with Boat in Long Island, and they surveilled possible locations for the hit. They decided that Kubecka's house was not the ideal spot. Instead, they picked the location of his office on 41 Brightside Avenue in Northport. Their intended targets would be Jerry and Robert Kubecka, father and son. On August 9, 1989, Kubecka received 3 calls. 2 were threatening him, and the last one was a death threat. He called the Organized Crime Task Force to report the threats he received and spoke to Task Force investigator Alvin Jones, who advised him to call the Suffolk County Police Department, which Kubecka did. The police showed up and just made a report. According to his family, Kubecka was upset because he placed his life in danger to help law enforcement, who ultimately disclosed his name, and he felt his life was now in the hands of the mob. On August 10, 1989, around 6 a.m., the hit team pulled up to Kubecka's office in 2 cars, one driven by Boat and the other by Carmine Avellino. The shooters, Frankie Pearl and Vitulli, got out and entered the building. In a hallway, the first person they encountered was Donald Barstow, who they quickly shot and killed. Kubecka would prove to be a harder target. Obviously, hearing the gunshots, he was not caught off guard. Instead, he struggled with the shooters and even managed to injure Frankie Pearl. Shots were widely fired into the walls, floor, and a refrigerator. The office furniture was upended, and blood from Frankie Pearl left a small puddle on the floor. Kubecka was fighting for his life. However, the shooters did manage to hit Kubecka 3 times before running away. Besides the blood, they left a crucial piece of evidence behind, a black duffel bag containing their guns. But Kubecka was still alive and managed to call 911. He told the dispatcher, "I've been shot. 2 people have been shot. Send help." The dispatcher tried to get him to identify the gunman, but his voice was fading. He said he struggled to remain conscious and couldn't move. When the police arrived, they found him slumped at his desk. Kubecka was rushed to Huntington Hospital, and at some point, he identified his attackers as white and in their 40s. Later that morning, he would die from his injuries. The day after the murders, the victims' wives read in the newspaper a quote from law enforcement saying that both men were offered to enter the witness protection program, but they refused, a statement that was totally untrue. As a result, the women filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state. In October 1989, as a reward for the hit, Frankie Pearl was inducted into the Lucchese family. Vitulli would be inducted as well. In February 1994, Sal Avellino pled guilty to racketeering charges that included the conspiracy to murder Kubecka and Barstow. He received a 10.5-year sentence. In January 1995, federal prosecutors indicted Anthony Barada, Carmine Avellino, Rocco Vitulli, and Frankie Pearl for the 1989 murders of Robert Kubecka and Donald Barstow. At the time, Frankie Pearl had already fled to Italy. In July 1996, the government permitted Barada, Avellino, and Vitulli to plead guilty to lesser charges. In December 1996, a state court judge found New York State negligent for the deaths of Kubecka and Barstow and ordered the state to pay the families $10.8 million. On January 27, 2003, Frankie Pearl was arrested in a Bronx donut shop on Tremont Avenue. His DNA was taken, which matched the blood found at the crime scene. In September 2004, he received a 15-year sentence. As usual, law enforcement, specifically the FBI and prosecutors, were only concerned with making a case. The FBI agents working the case failed to protect their witnesses, which is common. And when it was too late, they did their usual, damage control by means of lying. In the final analysis, only one word comes to mind, and it's a reoccurring word: greed. As a result of greed, 2 legitimate working guys lost their lives, and many people went to prison as a result. Was it all worth it? I think not. Not even the $10.8 million the families received, as it'll never bring back their loved ones. If you think about it, in the end, the only winners were the FBI and the government, because they got exactly what they live for: convictions. And for them, nothing else matters.